Hey there. Welcome to Wednesday night. Helen, it's here early. We appreciate that. Always good to be early. There's a football coach that said if you're on time, you're late. So early is good. Yeah. So tonight, like I said in the description, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to jump right in because I have a lot of notes and there's no Bay State Live tonight. So I might even take a few of Brian Spicer's minutes in your Wednesday night. But I thought this was something important to stop and reflect on during Holy Week. And so, one announcement for our Brookridge people: our Good Friday service is at 6 p.m. So, 2 nights from now, 6 p.m., in person only. We have streamed it in the past, but we're going to be doing it downstairs in the fellowship hall. A little bit more of a cool setting with no lights, and going to do a communion service with the family, but not going to stream it. So if you would like to be part of our Good Friday service, then I would suggest that you be there in person. Okay? So Brookridge Good Friday service, 6 p.m. in person only. That's all I have to say about that. And so I'm going to jump in. So those of you who are used to like coming on like midstream, mid-list, maybe it's going to be no list. I had something that I really wanted to cover this week that hopefully will be an encouragement for you as you reflect and study and kind of sit back and take everything in from Palm Sunday to Good Friday to Easter, Resurrection Sunday. We're excited about that, but something to think about. Hey, John Irwin. All right, I think we're ready. Let's do this. So, this week is Holy Week, a time when Christians around the globe have collectively turned our attention toward the crucifixion and death and burial of Jesus Christ on our way toward Easter, which is a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. But it was during the crucifixion of Jesus that he uttered one of the most famous lines in really all of human history. Even if you don't read your Bible, you're probably familiar with the reality that as Jesus hung suffering on the cross, he cried out at one point, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it brings up an important question as we think about that. And as billions of people over the years have come around that saying, why did he say that? Why in that moment of anguish did he cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a good question to ask. Albert Schweitzer said that cry from Jesus indicated that Jesus died as a deluded apocalyptic, that his messianic expectations went unfulfilled. And when life got really hard, this man who preached hope lost it all at the end. That's what he felt that it was, a cry of utter defeat and ruin at the end of his ministry. If that's true, why do we call that day Good Friday? That's not good. That's the worst day ever. If this man who preached redemption and hope lost all of his hope at the end, if that's what's really happening here, that would be horrible. Why would we celebrate that and sing about that? Spoiler alert, that's not what he was saying. So we got to figure out, why did Jesus say that? And it's not just a theological problem we have to answer. It's a personal problem. If we're going to be selfish for a minute, we got to ask the question, all right, if there was no better person on the planet than Jesus, and at his greatest point of need, God abandoned him, what hope do you and I have when we suffer? What's going to happen to me when I go through some of the most difficult times? What happens when I feel like God has forsaken me? Like, where am I with him when I suffer? Health struggles, funerals, financial difficulties, like, you know what they feel like, whether it's an external trial and suffering or just something going on inside. You have grieved over a relationship not working out, or a time where you said, hey, I've been praying and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? So we got to figure out, number one, why did Jesus say this? Number two, what does it mean for me when I enter my time of suffering? When I need him most, is God going to ditch me? And then number three, what do we do with all of this? How is this encouragement to us as a community? So Jesus' cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" was a quote from Psalm 22. It was called the Psalm of the Innocent Sufferer. And it was most likely written by King David, a solid 1,000 years before Jesus was born. So we're going to look into this psalm And it's going to give us some insight into why it was Jesus' cry of choice on the cross and what it means for us when things are darkest. So here's Psalm 22. If you want to follow along on the screen, you can. If you want to follow along on your device, you can. But it opens up with that heart-wrenching cry in verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. When you read that, it begs the question, what was going on with David? Like, we actually don't really know what specific crisis he was going through. He doesn't give us a lot of detail about the original problem, but we know he went through a lot of things. And what he was going through right then at this moment was pretty intense. Most likely, maybe experiencing physical pain and rejection. We know he went through a lot of that. But at the deepest root, there's something else going on here. What's really in focus here for him is not a sense of the physical pain he's going through, but a distress at the sense of God's distance. What's upsetting for David was what felt like a total contradiction between his theology and his experience. He says, "You're my God," 3 times. And in doing that, he unites the transcendence and immanence. He's like, okay, so you're God, the Almighty One who rules the world. You're transcendent above everything, but you're also intimate. You're my God. I'm connected to you. Later, he'll call him Yahweh, which was the covenant name of God. The way it worked back then and the way it works now is when you made a covenant with God, you say, I give my whole life to you. I donate my life to you. I belong to you. I'm yours. And on the flip side, you're my God. And namely, what that means is you'll be my provider and my protector. So David understood that's the connection that I have with God. And he hit a moment of crisis in his life. And he's like, okay, I'm calling it in. I'm filing my claim. I'm in trouble. You said you're a very present help in the time of trouble. I'm in trouble, so come get me. And there in that moment, he looks around and God seems absent. And what's distressing him is, hey, I thought it worked this way, that you love me. When I'm in need, I cry out to you and you help me. So what's going on here? So what's hurting him in this moment is not even the problem. It's the sense of rejection. It's that feeling of being forsaken, of I'm in crisis and I want to run to your arms for you to hold on to me. And then I watch the door slam, hear the bolt click. Like, what is this? Have you ever felt that way? Like God's silent? Like you bring your problems to him, there's no answer, and you're like, what is going on here? And for David, the silence of God is just deafening in his moment of suffering, and it's stressing him out. But he decides to press in, to enter into the struggle and figure out, okay, why is God forsaking me? Why am I crying out and he's not answering? Why is God forsaking me? Is it a God problem? Like, is it him? No, because he says in verse 3, he says, yet you are holy. He acknowledges, God, you're pure. You're not duplicitous. You're not fake. You don't change. There's not some character flaw in God. So it's not that. And then he says, you're enthroned on the praises of Israel. What does that mean? Well, back then, when the people of Israel would pray, they would pray toward the temple, because in the temple there was a Holy of Holies that housed the Ark of the Covenant, which had a lid on the top called the mercy seat. It was a picture of the throne of God. And as they would pray, they would swing incense with the idea that incense is like the prayers of the people. And God said when he was establishing the groundwork for the temple, he said, in the same way that this incense rises up around the Ark of the Covenant, is the same way your prayers come to me. God was telling his people, hey, I'm God. I'm holy. I don't change. And I hear you. Like, I'm not deaf. I didn't miss you. I hear the prayers of my people. So the writer says, okay, you're holy, you hear people, and you don't just hear. He said, when the fathers cried out for you, it worked for them. In verses 4 and 5, repeated 3 times, they trusted you, they trusted you, they trusted you. And he goes on to say, the fathers, the believers of old, trusted you and you delivered them. They cried out and you rescued them, and they trusted in you and they weren't put to shame. He's reminding himself, even in the moment of crisis, God's holy and God hears. And God helped the fathers back then and came through for those people. So he's trying to preach to himself to get hope. But then when he compares it to his experience, it starts to stress him out even more. He's like, okay, God's holy. God listens. God cared for the fathers, but he's still not answering me. I'm groaning and you're far from saving. I'm crying and you're not answering. I cry and I know no rest. There's that contradiction between my faith and what the Bible tells me and my experience that is causing the stress. He says, there's some kind of breakdown here, and I know it's not you, God, because you're holy. So maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the problem. So in verse 6, he says, you know what? I'm a worm and not a man. David's like, maybe that's the problem. You're holy, you're good, you help other people, but apparently I'm not worth your time. I'm a nobody. I've seen and heard of a lot of people giving up on Christianity after having a moment of crisis where they really needed God to come through and he didn't, or they felt like he didn't. So either he doesn't care or I'm not worth his time, so I'm out. God was silent, so I'm done with him. Maybe he felt that. And David's saying, maybe it's me. I'm a nobody. And not only am I a nobody, he says, I'm a joke. The silence of God is tough on him. It's hard. This was the guy that was called the man after God's own heart. And what makes this worse is his peers aren't silent. That empty space gets filled with mockery. He says, I'm scorned by mankind, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. The primary problem was the silence of God. The secondary problem is the cruelty of people. I think most of us know that people can be cruel, right? Psalm 22 declares it. Also see the internet, that we sometimes like to kick people when they're down. And here he's crying out for help, and all he gets is laughter and ridicule. Verse 8, they said to him, you trust in the Lord? Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one he delights in. And they kind of mock his faith. Why does David care what other people say? I think it hurts because it's got a little truth to it. He's like, yeah, I do belong to God, and God's not here with me. So he starts to talk to himself again. He's like, yeah, maybe I'm a nobody, but they're saying I'm yours. So I might be a nobody, but I'm your nobody. So he flips it around again. He's in crisis. I hope you feel that. Some of you who have wrestled with God, that's what's happening here. He's wrestling, saying, yeah, I'm a nobody, but I'm your nobody, God. And verse 9 says, you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. Once on you I was cast from my birth, from my mother's womb. You have been my God. He's like, God, you're the one who grabbed me. You're the one who came to get me. You're the one who caused me to believe when I was a kid. You made me one of your people. That's how you work. So in the middle of his suffering and his crisis, he's trying to put the pieces together theologically. He's like, okay, God's holy. God doesn't change. God hears my prayers and cries, but I'm a nobody. So maybe God's blowing me off, but no, I'm his nobody. He grabbed me and he pulled me in. So why is he forsaking me? He gets to a moment when he realizes there's nothing good in him. He doesn't start pulling out all the reasons why God should pay attention to him, but he's gotten to the point of wrestling. I don't understand why he's not listening to me, and people are mocking me, and I'm not sure how to connect all this, but I know that you're holy, you're good, and you called me to you. So in verse 11, he turns the corner and he cries out, be not far from me, for trouble is near and there is none to help. I don't know what kind of pain you're wrestling with or you've experienced. But in verse 11, he doesn't say, so solve my problem, God. Deal with this thing. Give me this answer. Heal this relationship. Give me the job. He doesn't do that. What does he say? He makes it personal. He says, don't be far from me. Come be with me. It's relational. It's communal. It's like, yeah, I want this problem solved, but I want the distance covered. I want you near me. Please be near me. And I hope you get some encouragement from that today, that in the midst of his suffering and his struggle, David is not moving away from God. He's moving toward God, because even in the midst of the struggle, he understands that it's a struggle with a God who he's allowed to talk to like this, that he's supposed to talk to like this. You don't talk to your banker like this. You don't enter into formal relationships like this. I don't talk to Brian Spicer like that. Like, just don't be far from me. Like, just be with me. No, he doesn't want that relationship with me. It'd be weird. But you talk to a spouse that way, or you should. Someone you're in a covenant relationship with, that you're bound with for life. If you feel emotional distance and struggling, you should say things like that. Like, I feel far from you. I want you near me. I want to be close to you. The Bible is a very three-dimensional book. It's showing you how to struggle with God. It's relationship. It's not, here's 3 steps to a happy life. It's a relationship, and there's dynamics and confusion. And whenever you communicate, you risk being misunderstood. And there's some misunderstanding in here. So David's like, I don't understand all of what's going on, but I really want you close to me. So what you hear in this moment is you don't see a guy who's given up. If he'd given up, what would he have done? He would have stopped talking. When counseling married couples, when people come in yelling and screaming at each other, that's not actually the worst situation. It's actually a good situation. I mean, it's not good, but if you see a husband and wife yelling at each other, what's happening? They want the other person to understand them, and they want the other person to get their point of view. They want to reach a point of understanding, even though they might be doing it in the wrong way, in unhealthy ways, not saying helpful things to each other. At least they're facing each other and trying to work on it. Like, I want to be understood. I want to connect. The scary relationships, the one counselors say have almost no hope, is when there's disdain, or when one partner is cold. Like, I don't care. I don't care what he says. I don't care. When communication stops, that's when the relationship is in deep trouble. And so here in Psalm 22, the relationship is white hot. Like, hot, you can bend, right? A piece of metal. Cold just shatters. And here, this relationship between David and God has this heat of struggle, of I'm in this with you and I'm struggling. So when Jesus cried out, "Why have you forsaken me, God?" It wasn't a loss of hope. It was actually the presence of hope. He's like, "Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far?" He was engaging God. It's not the cry of a lack of hope. It's a cry from hope. Like, I believe you're listening. I believe you care. And I'm going to dialogue with you until we get to a place of clarity. One man said, when David and Jesus cried out this, "Why have you forsaken me?" they weren't primarily looking for explanation, but for action. When Jesus cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" he wasn't looking for an explanation of why. It was a call to action. What does that mean? You do this with your kids. You'll say to them, "Why are you whining like that?" And when you say that, you're not looking for an explanation. "Well, it's because I don't respect you and I'm tired." And you're like, "Okay, I'm glad I know that. I just cognitively wanted to process that. I'm going to stew on that for a while." No, you're saying to them, "Why are you whining?" But you're not looking for an explanation. You're looking for them to change your behavior. You're asking why, but what you really mean is stop whining, right? And here, if you didn't catch it implicitly in verse 1, it becomes very explicit in verse 11. I'm asking why you're forsaking me, not because I want God to say, "Well, for these reasons I'm forsaking you." It's because I want you to stop forsaking me and be near me. So it's not a cry of a loss of hope. It's a cry from hope of, I believe there's a relationship here that's worth fighting for. So David's fighting for it. And I hope this is encouraging to you too, because you're meant to do that. David prays like this. Jesus prayed like this. And you and I should pray like this in the midst of our greatest suffering. Don't move away from God. Move toward him. Like, beat on his chest if you have to, but engage in the relationship. He's calling you to talk to him like this. And so Jesus does this. Why? Because I think he's honestly communicating his anguish on the cross. I think that's why Jesus quoted from Psalm 22. He was quoting this, "God, I'm suffering and I want you near." And I get that. I certainly don't understand it to the fullness, not even close to what he went through. But I think Jesus, as he hung there on the cross, and he who knew no sin became sin for us, this day wasn't a surprise to him. But I think when he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" part of it for him was, why is this taking so long? Like, why are you so far? Like, a second of distance from his father would have been brutal for him. So for minutes to click by and hours, I think he just screamed this out in anguish. I think he's just saying, "Hey, I want this to be over." But I think there's another reason why Jesus picked this particular psalm when he was on the cross, because there's other verses he could have quoted to put words to his pain. I think he picked this one because he was a good teacher. And in that moment, he wanted to show us something. And this is where it gets really, really crazy. Because I think if you've been tracking verses 1 to 11, you're like, yeah, I can resonate with some of this. I can feel some of this. But in the next several verses, the experience of the person writing tends to just zoom past us in terms of the depth of suffering. It's like, I'm kind of with you. I'm with you. No, actually, what you went through was way worse. And not only is it way worse, it gets very, very specific, strangely specific. David breaks back into lament in verses 12 through 18. And he goes through a couple of cycles that are roughly parallel, that basically talk about the strength of his enemies and the powerlessness of the righteous sufferer. So he pictures these people tormenting him as animals. Why animals? Because they have power and no conscience. So we'll go to verses 12 to 18 there. He says, "Bulls encompass me." Because these people are like bulls. When you think of a bull, you think of power. He says, "Strong bulls of Bashan surround me." There's no escape. And they're not just bulls, they're strong bulls from an area known for welfare and livestock. What he's saying is, my enemies have come around me. There's no escape. They're at the peak of their strength, and they're not just like bulls. They're like lions. They're not just strong. They want to use that strength to tear me apart. And meanwhile, while they're at their strongest, I'm at my weakest. He says in verse 14, I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within my breast. If you've ever walked a long way, you might have heard that phrase, legs feel like jello, like meaning they've lost their structure. They've lost their ability to hold together. They're disintegrating. They're falling apart. But they didn't have jello in 1000 BC. So he's like, I'm like water and I'm like wax. Water has no substance, has no structure. Wax, when it melts, it loses structure. And here in the midst of his suffering, he's saying, all my strength is gone. He's like, my body's breaking down. It's coming apart. He says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd. I'm like a plant without water. I'm shriveling up. And then in verse 15, he says, my strength is dried up. My tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. So he does a pronoun switch here. He's like, these enemies are after me, but he's talking to God. And he says, behind all this, God, you're the one who put me here. That sounds pretty horrible, right? Like God did that. Like God's the ultimate agent behind the suffering. It sounds like betrayal. Like, God, you're a part of this? But I think it can also sound a little bit like hope. What do I mean by that? Like, imagine taking your toddler to get shots. Like, bad day, hard day. When you're 2 years old, you don't understand a lot of the mechanics of what's going on, but you realize that some grown-ups are going to hold you down and stick needles in you. Not a good day. But the question is, when you're that little and you don't understand why these people are doing these things to you, which is worse? To have mom there and have that instant sense of betrayal of, why are you doing this? But then maybe behind that, a sense of, but you're here and I know you love me. I got a couple of years of backup proof that you love me. So maybe there's some purpose in this. Or would you rather have her just be gone and you're in the hands of ruthless people that don't care about you? Which is worse? I would say this has a bit of hope. David says, I'm surrounded by enemies and I hate this, and you're behind them. I don't get it, but you're back there. I see you. He says, the dogs encompass me. They feast on death. The company of evildoers encircle me. And then he starts to get strangely specific. He says, they've pierced my hands and feet. That word pierced in Hebrew means to bore a hole. They bored holes in my hands and feet. He says, I can count all my bones, meaning my body is stretched out and I can see my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing, they cast lots. They start distributing my things in front of me before I'm even dead. Now, some of you hear this and you're like, piercing my hands and feet, gloating over me, dividing my garments, casting lots for my clothes. I've heard this before. This is what happened to Jesus on the cross. Yeah. And now's a probably good time to remind you that this was written 1,000 years before Jesus was on the scene. 1,000 years, 4 times the length that there's been in America. That's like the Vikings describing an iPhone. Like, yeah, swipe left if you want to delete. Now, it's weirdly specific. And let me tell you something that I hope starts dawning on you, that why, when Jesus was in the middle of his suffering, he selected this psalm to quote from the cross. Because I think in the midst of that moment, as a good teacher, he thought, I want to cry out my pain, but I want to do it in a way that will reach my disciples, the people who love me, who are watching all of their dreams get smashed in front of them, watching as their hero gets humiliated in front of everybody, while they experience that and try to live into that. As you read the Gospels, and you see their hopes dashed in the middle of that moment, to hear him cry out like this, with the hopes that they would remember the song they sang as kids, at some point they picked up on it, because Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, as they begin to write their stories of the gospel, they realize, no, I saw this. Matthew talks about when they crucified him, they divided his garments among them and cast lots. He wrote, those who passed by derided them, wagging their heads. So also the chief priests and the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now. And in the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus quotes this psalm. Why? So his disciples, in the midst of their suffering, when it seemed like everything had gone crazy, could hear a reminder from 1,000 years before saying, there is someone behind this, that God is ruling all of this, that God called this shot, and maybe there's some purpose to all this. Now, there's some comfort in hearing that, but I'm sure for them, they don't just go, okay, there's a plan that was set in motion a long time ago for this, but I still don't understand the plan. Like, to what end is this happening? Why? Well, as the psalm shifts, we're going to see in verses 19 through 21, this cry out again for help. Do not be far off. Come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul. Save me from the mouth of the lion. So David's crying out, don't be far. Come quickly to me. Deliver me. Save me. And he's not even out of the verse in verse 21 when he says, you have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. It's like, what? When did that happen? It was like, don't be far from me. Help me. Come quickly. Deliver me. Save me. Saved. Done. When did that happen? Seriously, like what on earth? And he uses the perfect tense of the verb, it's done. He's crying out, help me, deliver, save. Oh, good. I'm out. What? Commentators, what? These cats are crazy. Commentators, when asked what happened in the middle of verse 21, not even the next verse, David doesn't even wait. It's in the middle of verse 21. They're like, I don't know. But somehow he goes from surrounded by bulls and lions and dogs to surrounded by the brothers who are praising a God who saves. And you see that in verse 22 through the end of the chapter. It says, I'll tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I'll praise you. So now David's surrounded by friends and they're singing. You who fear the Lord, praise him. The offspring of Jacob, glorify him. Stand in awe of him. He's saying, all my people, my Jewish people, celebrate God. Why? Because he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. And he has not hidden his face from him. He heard him when he cried to him. He says he didn't reject me. It looked like he did, but he didn't. And not only did he not reject me, in verse 25, from you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. He says, I was afflicted. I thought he wasn't hearing me, but he heard me and he delivered me. And not only me, but everyone who's afflicted would be at a banquet, a party, praising the God who gives life. Jesus said it as much. Remember the Last Supper, the night he was betrayed? He's having a meal with his disciples and he broke the bread and he said, this is my body broken for you. And he held up the cup and he passed it around. He said, this is my blood that's about to be poured out. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be murdered. But when I rise again, we're going to celebrate in the new kingdom and have a meal together. And the disciples were like, what? Okay. And they really didn't understand. But in this moment, you have suddenly in this place, this psalm from 1,000 years ago declaring it's going to get really bad. And then suddenly, bad's over. And in that moment, there's going to be a party and the brothers will come over to celebrate together because God heard me when I was afflicted. And from him will come praise, and not just praise for me, but all the afflicted who come to my table will eat and be satisfied. And not just all the Jewish people. In verse 27, David says, and all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will worship before you. Kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules over the nation. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All the rich people are going to come and worship. Before him shall bow all those who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. All the poor people are going to come to him. All kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds are going to come. And then not only all these people from all nations and all families from all different backgrounds, he says, posterity shall serve him, and it shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So not just my people, but every family on the planet of people throughout time. People are going to celebrate God, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. And the incredible suffering of the righteous one will result in joy and celebration and praise for people of all nations, all families, all walks of life, all statuses for all time. And now when you hear that, you're like, this psalm suddenly got just a lot bigger than David. Like, that's what I went through. The suffering, my vindication, redemption will be a call to celebrating for people from every nation and every family, even yet unborn. That's bigger than David because it's about the son of David. It's about the Son of God. It's about Jesus Christ, who suffered and died at the hands of sinful men, according to the expressed will of God, so that by his blood he could purchase men and women from every tribe and tongue and nation. So we could remember, even in our darkest days, kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules the nations. Your pain is not outside his plan. His plans are good for his children. He who ordained to take the darkest day in history, the crucifixion of Jesus, and make it the instrument of our redemption, can take even our darkest days and redeem them for his glorious purposes. That's true. So that we can say, along with David, he hasn't despised or abhorred the afflicted. He hasn't hidden his face from me. He heard me. So I just want to kind of close this out. I know this is a little longer than normal, but I want to answer our questions to some degree of finality. Like, why did Jesus cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think he was expressing the anguish of being separated from God, as he who knew no sin became sin for us. I think it was a true cry of pain. And I also think he did it as a teacher to point us to the fact that his suffering was designed by God for greater purposes, for our redemption, to call out a congregation who would worship him for all days. What does this mean for us? It means we can and we should cry out to God when we're suffering. Whatever you're going through, family distress, financial distress, internal or emotional turmoil, you cry out to him because you know he wants to hear it. And you cry out to him as people who know that if God took the darkest day in history with Jesus' death and used it as the means of purchasing the redemption and joy and celebration of people from all nations, that he will take your dark days and redeem them for his purposes. You can have that kind of hope. The writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 22 as well. I'll show you in Hebrews chapter 2. He says that Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I'll sing your praise. It leads you to the natural question, when did Jesus say that? And it doesn't tell us. Some people think that on the cross, Jesus quoted all of Psalm 22. I don't know. I have no idea. But I know that he said it. Jesus said, I'm going to go low so God will raise me high. And as I come high, I'm going to redeem some people. I'm going to be part of a family that will come around me, and my suffering will be an instrument of their redemption. And so the Hebrews writer says in chapter 2, verse 14, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Therefore he has been made to be like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the servants of God, to make propitiation or substitution for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. So this presents two pictures of Jesus. One as the champion who fights on our behalf. He fought as our representative. So when he won, like, we get the spoils. And he says, Jesus went to death and tasted it so you don't have to. He beat death so you can have hope and life. And then he also presents him as a high priest that's sympathetic, that Jesus went through enormous suffering to buy your redemption. So when you and I go through enormous suffering, we don't have to look up and say, God, you have no idea what this is like. I think he does. I think he does. And you can know he knows exactly what this is like. He knows what rejection from your close friends looks like. He knows what mockery and bullying looks like. He knows what physical pain looks like. He's tasted it. He knows it. And he also knows that the God who ordained that his suffering be redeemed it, because he works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. So when you're in the middle of suffering, say, Jesus, I know you know this suffering, and I know that you know there's purpose in it. So I'm yours, and I trust you. And the last thing is, what do we do with this? I love that place the psalm ends, because it ends with saying that from you comes my praise in the great congregation. It said, my vows I'll perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So as we see the affliction of Jesus and his redemption, when we experience our own affliction, we can trust that God will use even that. And what happens when we live that story with Jesus? We become mouthpieces of redemption to people around us. that as a community, we celebrate a God who would do this, who would take even our darkest moments and make them glorious. We celebrate that. God saying, trust me, cling to me. Don't run from me in your pain. Run towards me. I'm taking you through this pain for a purpose. He wants to do some healing in your life, some mending of some things in you that you thought maybe would always be broken, so that one day you can confidently proclaim to the world, I love him. I love him because he came for me and he got me and I'm his and he's my God and he does not abhor the affliction of the afflicted. So I will praise him in the congregation. I will celebrate him before all the peoples. I'll proclaim his name even to those who aren't born yet because he has done it. He rescued and he redeemed through Jesus, and he will rescue and redeem all who call upon his name. This was the ultimate mic drop, the best hashtag ever. Hashtag he has done it. So I hope you're encouraged. Psalm 22 is a big deal. He was forsaken so that we never had to be. And he went through suffering, so we know that there is a purpose behind the pain and that we have a God that wants to hear from us in the middle of it. So I hope you're encouraged. I hope as we navigate through this week, you will just be overwhelmed with gratefulness that Jesus was willing to step in and take our place. And then as we get to the weekend and Sunday, that you will just be overwhelmed with worship and praise as we celebrate a God who lives. We celebrate a Savior who died but was resurrected and lives, and we get to live too. Thanks for hanging with me. Hope you're encouraged. Hope you're excited for Friday night, 6:00. No live streaming. Sunday, we absolutely will be live streaming, and we'll be there in person. Looking forward to it. Easter Sunday is going to be awesome. We will catch you all later.